You were born into a broken body. Something was done to your father before you existed. It got inside him. It damaged the exact part of him that was going to become you. And you've been carrying it your whole life. Your illnesses aren't bad luck. They were handed to you. Somebody did this. They knew they had done it. And then they spent the rest of the century making sure you could never prove it. That's the claim. Not mine, theirs. Thousands of people in this country, and others, believe that sentence is a literal description of their own bodies. Hundreds of thousands more around the world believe it about theirs. And for 60 years, they've been trying to get somebody in authority to say it out loud. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to take that sentence apart one clause at a time and find out how much of it is true. I'm going to tell you now that some of it is true. It is documented, admitted, paid out in court, written into statute levels of true.
На сегодня 299 человек госпитализирован, 7 из них скончались.
And one clause of it has never been demonstrated in a single human being on Earth. Working out which is which has taken me through 6 governments, 40 years of genetics, 7 million laboratory mice, and a memo that somebody buried for 47 years. So let's start with the men who say it first. In 1958, a 19-year-old British serviceman stood on a beach in the Pacific with his back to a hydrogen bomb. Shorts, a cotton t-shirt, he'd been told to face away, shut his eyes, and put his hands over them. And in the flash, he saw the bones of his hands. That detail comes up again and again in testimony of the men who were out there. Through your eyelids, through the flesh of your fingers, for a fraction of a second, your own skeleton is visible. Thousands of them went through it. And then they came home, they got jobs and had children. And some of those children were born with things wrong with them that nobody has ever been able to explain. They're not the only ones asking either. Vietnam veterans whose children were born with spina bifida, women in their 20s turning up with a cancer that belongs to women in their 70s because of a pill their mothers were handed while they were pregnant. Islanders in the Pacific who let their children play in the fallout because it looked like snow, and none of them had ever seen snow. Children in immigration camps whose scalps were x-rayed by the state in bulk on a production line. 4 countries, 4 decades, 4 different governments. All of them end up at the same sentence. And to work out whether that sentence can possibly be true, you need one piece of biology. Just one. Get this, and then the whole film opens up. Damage to your ordinary body cells, your lungs, your thyroid, your bone marrow even, it can absolutely kill you. It causes cancer, and when you die, it dies with you. But 2 cells in the human body don't obey that rule: sperm and eggs. The only cells whose DNA anybody ever inherits. You break those specifically and you have changed something that outlives you. 2 different wombs, but only one of them travels. And, oh boy, it travels. That's the part that should worry you. Because starting in 1947 in a laboratory in Tennessee, a geneticist spent decades irradiating mice and counting what came out the other side. Not hundreds, 7 million of them. What he proved is in every textbook on the subject. Damage the germline of a mammal with radiation, and its offspring carries mutations their parents never had. And humans are mammals. We have known about that since the 1950s. It's not fringe, it's not even disputed. It's the reason your own government has an official position on how much radiation is safe for somebody who wants a child. So nobody is arguing about whether this is possible. It is possible. We proved it on mammals. The only question left is whether it happened to these people. And one more thing before we start. On the 17th of April 1947, a colonel in the United States Army Corps of Engineers sat down to write about medical experiments on human beings. 1 page addressed to a doctor at Oak Ridge, ordinary enough that it got typed, filed, and then forgotten. Here's what it says. It is desired that no document be released which refers to experiments with humans and might have adverse effects on public opinions or result in legal suits. Nothing in there about stopping. Nothing in there about telling the men. Release no document. It took 47 years for anybody outside that building to read that sentence, and by the time they did, most of the people it was written about were already dead. So we have 6 pieces of evidence, 6 chapters, and 1 sentence on trial. Let's find out how much damage has been passed on to us and how much of it can be proved. To damage a person's DNA, you have to physically get at it. So let's start with the substance that does it most visibly, because once you've seen how it works, everything else in this film is going to make sense. Sulfur mustard. Everyone knows mustard gas as a First World War horror. Blistering lungs, blinded men, a smell like horseradish drifting across no man's land. Less well known is what it's done once it's inside you. It's called a bifunctional alkylating agent, so it has 2 reactive arms, and the things it likes to grab onto more than anything else is a specific atom on one of the 4 letters of the genetic code, the N7 position on guanine. With one arm, it sticks to a single base. Chemists call that a monoadduct. It's annoying, it's survivable, and it's the more mutagenic of the 2 outcomes because your cell can misread it and copy the mistake forwards. With both arms, it does something worse. It grabs a guanine on one strand and a guanine on the other, and it welds them together. That's an interstrand crosslink. Your DNA is a zip. To copy itself, to make a new cell, it has to unzip. A crosslink is a rivet through the teeth. The cell isn't defenseless. It has repair crews, and they're good, and they'll cut most single adducts out cleanly. But a crosslink takes a full emergency response, several repair systems working the same lesion at once, and sometimes that works perfectly. Sometimes it doesn't. What's left behind after a botched repair is a swapped base, a missing chunk, a chromosome joined back to the wrong chromosome. That's a mutation, physical, permanent, written into the cell. Now, the pharmaceutical footnote to all of this, because someone looked at a weapon that was very good at stopping cells dividing and thought, well, cancer cells divide. The nitrogen mustards became the first chemotherapy drugs. Mechlorethamine, chlorambucil, melphalan, and cyclophosphamide is still on the WHO Essential Medicine list. If you've had a relative go through chemo in the last 70 years, there is a good chance they were treated with the grandchild of a weapon. Because it's the same chemistry, right? It's the same crosslink, it's just pointed at a tumour instead of a guy in a trench. Which brings us to the part nobody advertises. To learn how mustard hurts a body, well, you need bodies. Porton Down opened in Wiltshire in 1916, and it has been the United Kingdom's chemical and biological research establishment ever since. Between 1939 and 1989, at least 20,000 British servicemen took part in trials there. The surviving records start in 1942. The Second World War was the peak of the mustard work. As many as 8,000 volunteers were exposed to it. After 1945, the focus moved to nerve agents, with around 3,500 more. The word volunteer does a lot of heavy lifting in those sentences. Many of the men who arrived at Porton Down were told they were helping to test a cure for the common cold. That's what went into the letters home. That's what they were telling their mates. Some of them found out what had actually been done to them 50 years later from a police officer. Because in 1999, Wiltshire Police opened a criminal investigation into Porton Down. It was called Operation Antler. 13 officers, 5 years, 50 years of trials on the table from 1939 to 1989. They interviewed more than 700 people, and the government eventually had to release an extra £870,000 to keep it running. Files went to the Crown Prosecution Service, but nobody was ever prosecuted. What the veterans got in January 2008 was £3 million shared between 360 men. Work it out and it's around £8,300 each. On the 31st of January that year, the Veterans Minister Derek Twiggs stood up in the Commons and said this: "Those may have been affected." Here's the detail that matters most for this film, the one that's coming back in Act 6. The men who went to Porton Down signed the Official Secrets Act, which meant they went to their GPs 30 years later with something wrong with their skin or in their lungs or with their chest, and they were not legally able to say where they had been or what they had been exposed to. You cannot study a population that isn't allowed to describe itself. And Britain wasn't particularly unusual with this, it's just smaller. Between 1942 and 45, the United States military exposed more than 60,000 of its own servicemen to mustard gas and lewisite. The program stayed classified until 1993. Most of the country only found out about it properly in June 2015, when the journalist Caitlin Dickerson published an investigation for NPR that won a Peabody the following year. There were 3 kinds of tests: patch tests, where they put an agent directly on your skin; field tests, where they dropped it on you outdoors; and chamber tests, which are what they sound like: men sealed in a gas chamber in the dark until they broke. But that isn't the part that stops you. The subjects were sorted by race. African American, Japanese, American and Puerto Rican servicemen were used as test groups. White servicemen were used as the control. The army, well, they wanted to know whether skin color changed how a chemical weapon behaved, and it treated its own soldiers as a variable. One study obtained under the Freedom of Information, dated 1944, ran 39 Japanese American and 40 white soldiers through 20 days of mustard and lewisite exposure at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. The historian Susan Smith at the University of Alberta first laid the race dimension out in the academic literature in 2008, and almost nobody noticed for 7 more years. Rollins Edwards was a young black soldier who went into the chamber. He came out with skin that flaked off of him for the rest of his life. He kept some of it, decades of it, in a jar, because nobody in an official position had ever been willing to look at what happened to him and write it down properly. Louis Béchot was a Japanese American. NPR published his orders. His son had them for years without knowing what they meant. Juan Lopez Negron was a Puerto Rican and spent 3 weeks in hospital with a fever after his exposure. All 3 signed secrecy oaths. All 3 were told they could and would be prosecuted for talking. Some of these men could not even tell their wives. The reckoning, such as it came slowly. In 1991, the Department of Veterans Affairs formally recognized mustard gas injury. In 1993, the Institute of Medicine published a report called Veterans at Risk, which is still the definitive account of what these agents do to a person. And in 2015, after Dickerson's series aired, a bipartisan group of members of Congress led by Mike Honda demanded that the Secretary of Defense apologize. By then, most of the men were dead. So let's take the first clause of our sentence. That one's finished. It is over. The damage is physical. It is a chemical bonding to a molecule inside of a human being and snapping to it, and no government has seriously denied it for 40 years. One clause down. But before we move on, I need you to hold on to something, because it's going to come back at the end of this film, and it matters more than any study I'm going to show you. Those men signed the Official Secrets Act, which means that for the next 30 years, when they sat down in front of a doctor with something growing on them, they weren't legally allowed to say where they had been. Remember that. That single fact is going to end up being the reason we can't answer the question that this film is asking. Between 1961 and 1971, American aircraft sprayed more than 20 million gallons of herbicide over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The operation was called Ranch Hand. The best known of the chemicals was Agent Orange, named for the stripe painted round its barrels, and in 1978, reported by the US General Accounting Office, puts the Vietnam figure at 11.2 million gallons between August of 1965 and 1971. The herbicide itself wasn't really the problem. The problem was a contaminant produced during manufacture in quantities nobody was measuring. TCDD, dioxin, one of the most toxic molecules human industry has ever produced by accident. Dioxin is fat soluble and oh boy is it stubborn. It doesn't flush or leave. It just sits in tissue for years and it interferes with the machinery of the cell at the level of gene expression. And here is where the state's hand is completely visible, which is why this case belongs in this film. This wasn't a product sold to consumers. It was specified by the military, procured by the military, and sprayed by the military over territory chosen by the military onto its own troops as well as everyone else. Veterans came home and started getting ill in patterns that didn't look random. Soft tissue sarcoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease, Parkinson's. And for years, they got the answer these stories always get. Prove it was us. Which for one man with one tumor is impossible. You cannot trace a single cancer back to one afternoon in a valley in 1968. So Congress did something unusual. The Agent Orange Act of 1991 created a legal mechanism called presumptive service connection. If you served in the right place at the right time, and you develop a condition on the list, causation is presumed. The veteran no longer has to prove the link. The state has conceded it in advance. The list is maintained by science. Every 2 years, the National Academies review the world's literature and publish a volume called Veterans and Agent Orange, and conditions get added when the evidence supports it. The PACT Act of 2022 widened it again. So on the somatic question, the argument is over. The American government has been paying out for 3 decades, not as a gesture, as a law. There's a second population, and they've had a very different experience of that concession. Vietnamese civilians were underneath the spray. Nobody has a clean number, but estimates are in the low millions, and they're contested in both directions. But the exposure is not in dispute, and the dioxin persisted in the soil and in the food chain for decades after the war ended. Nguyen Van Quai was a soldier in the North Vietnamese Army. Years later, he is being treated for cancer of the liver and the stomach, and both of his children were born with severe disabilities. He became a named plaintiff in a class action brought in the United States by a Vietnamese association for victims of Agent Orange against Dow, Monsanto, and around 35 other chemical firms. On the 10th of March 2005, Judge Jack B. Weinstein dismissed it. 233 pages. He found that Agent Orange as deployed did not constitute a poison banned under international law at the time, and that the manufacturers were shielded by the government contractor defense. They built what the government told them to build to the government specification. The United States Department of Justice filed a brief supporting the chemical companies. Let's just sit on the shape of that one for a second. The same substance, the same spray runs, compensated by statute on one side of the ocean, and on the other side, no basis under the law of any nation. But notice what we still haven't got. 2 clauses down, and both of them stand up. They damaged these men. It's written into the law. Every bit of it, though, is somatic. Nguyen Van Quai's cancer is his own. It's in his cells. It stays in his cells, and when he dies, it dies with him. The presumptive list is a list of things that happen to veterans. So on the evidence so far, the sentence stops here. Terrible, proven, and it ends with a man it happened to. Except in 1996, the United States government wrote something into law that says otherwise. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. In 1996, the United States government wrote into law that the children of Vietnam veterans could be paid compensation for being born with spina bifida. Let's go back over that because it's the first moment in the story where a state concedes something that crossed a generation. The instrument is the Agent Orange Benefits Act of 1996, enacted with Public Law 104-204. It created a whole new chapter of Title 38 of the US Code. The operative section is 38 US Code 1805, and the regulation is 38 CFR 3.814. I want to correct something here, and I'm going to do it on camera rather than quietly because I had this wrong in my own notes when I started. The benefit did not come from the 1991 Agent Orange Act. It's a separate statute, 5 years later, and it works in a completely different way. Under the 1996 Act, the money is paid to the children in the child's own right as a monthly allowance set at 3 levels, depending on the degree of disability, with healthcare and vocational training alongside it. All forms of spina bifida are covered, except spina bifida occulta, which is the mild version most people who have never find out about. And there's a wide provision that people very rarely hear about. If the veteran is a woman who served in Vietnam, her children are covered for a much longer list of birth defects. That's 38 US Code 1815, Regulation 38 CFR 3.815. Broader recognition quietly for a smaller group. Now, the thing I am obliged to tell you, and the thing that makes this film harder rather than easier, the science underneath that statute is weak. When the Institute of Medicine reviewed the evidence linking a father's Agent Orange exposure to spina bifida in his children, the strongest grade they could give it was limited or suggestive. That's a real category in their system, and it sits well below proof. It means there's a signal. It might be confounding, and reasonable scientists disagree. Congress legislated anyway. I don't actually think that's a scandal. Faced with thousands of families and evidence that was suggestive but incomplete, a legislator decided to err on the side of the child. That is a defensible choice, and arguably a decent one actually. But it is not proof of germline damage. It's a political and compassionate recognition, and if you want this film to be worth trusting, then I have to say so. Which brings us to the strangest case in this whole film, and the one that taught medicine the difference between a mutation and something that looks like one.
Relief is just a swallow away.
Diethylstilbestrol, DES, a synthetic estrogen, first made in 1938. No company patented it, which meant anybody could manufacture it, and eventually around 287 companies did. The US Food and Drug Administration approved it for human use on the 19th of September 1941. Then, on the 1st of July 1947, it approved a supplement adding a new indication. For the next 24 years, doctors gave it to pregnant women. Millions of them. The National Cancer Institute's estimate for exposure in the United States between 1940 and 1971, mothers and children together, is somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. It did not work. And that's not hindsight. It was known. It was known in 1953. At the University of Chicago, lying in hospital between September 1950 and November 1952, an obstetrician called William Dykman ran a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of DES in pregnancy. A properly designed study, well ahead of its time in method. The result was published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 1953, and the finding was unambiguous. Women given DES did no better than women given a placebo. On some measures, they actually did slightly worse. The drug carried on being prescribed for another 18 years, and the women in that trial had not been told they were in a trial. They didn't know they were taking DES. They didn't know some of them were getting a placebo. They were pregnant women attending a teaching hospital who assumed they were receiving care. They found out in 1975 and 1976, more than 20 years later, when the hospital wrote to them. That produced Mink versus University of Chicago, a class action on behalf of around 1,000 women against the university and Eli Lilly. In 1978, the court allowed a claim of battery to proceed. That is the legal term for physical contact without consent, which is what treating someone with a drug they haven't agreed to amounts to. The case settled $225,000 from the university, plus medical monitoring. So why is a drug company story in a film about state power? because the state is in this at every step. The FDA approved it in 41 and approved the pregnancy indication in 47. The FDA approved DES as a cattle growth promoter in 1954, and when a law was passed in 58 that should have banned carcinogens from the food supply outright, Congress wrote a specific carve-out for it. The DES proviso of 1962. When the FDA finally tried to ban it in livestock in the 70s, a federal appeals court overturned the ban in 74. And it took until 79 to finish the job. So that is 25 years of a known carcinogen in a meat supply with government approval, legislative protection, and judicial rescue. Now, the part that changed medicine. In the late 1960s, doctors in Boston started seeing something that shouldn't have existed. Clear cell adenocarcinoma of the vagina is a cancer of elderly women. It's rare in the elderly. In the young, it is practically unheard of. They had 8 cases, all of them in women between 15 and 22. Arthur Herbst, Howard Ufelder, and David Pocancer published in the New England Journal of Medicine on the 15th of April 1971. In 7 of the 8 cases, the girls' mothers had taken DES while pregnant with her. That is one of the tightest signals in the history of cancer epidemiology, and it came out of a sample of 8. The FDA responded in November 71 with a drug bulletin declaring pregnancy a contraindication and telling doctors to stop. Second correction, and I am flagging this one because it gets repeated everywhere, including in places that should know better. That was not a ban, it was a labeling change and an advisory notice to physicians. The bulletin itself hedged nothing that the evidence defined an association and not necessarily a cause and effect relationship. DES stayed on the market for other uses. Here's why DES belongs in this film and why it isn't the answer to it. A woman took a pill. 15 to 22 years later, her daughters got a signature cancer that has the shape of inheritance. It looks like damage handed down. The DES crossed the placenta and acted on the daughter's own developing tissue while she was exposed as a fetus. She was exposed directly in the womb at the point in development when her reproductive tract was forming. Nobody's germ cells mutated. The cancer wasn't transmitted through sperm or egg. A second person was standing in the blast radius and nobody could see her. Research on the 3rd generation and DES, the DES granddaughters, does exist, and some of it points at epigenetic mechanisms. Changes to how genes are switched on and off, rather than changes to the code itself. It is ongoing, and it is nowhere near as strong as the daughter data. So look at what Act 3 actually hands us. A government that paid out for a birth defect in the next generation on evidence its own scientists graded as suggestive, and a drug that hurt people 1 generation down without a single inherited mutation being involved. Which is worse than a dead end. A dead end you can walk away from. This is 2 pieces of evidence that look exactly like the thing we're hunting for, but neither of them is it. So we need to stop messing about with people and go look at the only experiment that could ever settle this properly. The one you're not allowed to run on humans. Right, if you wanted to answer this question properly, how would you do it? You take a population, irradiate half of them at a known dose, breed them, count the mutations in the offspring, and repeat until the numbers are big enough to actually mean something. Small problem being, you can't really do that with people. So in 1947, at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, a geneticist called William L. Russell started doing it with mice. The technique is called the specific locus test, and it's beautifully simple. Russell bred a tester strain of mice carrying 7 recessive marker genes, mostly for coat color. Cross an irradiated mouse with a tester mouse, and ordinarily the offspring look normal, but the healthier copy masks the recessive one. Unless radiation has broken that healthy copy, then there's nothing left to mask it, and the mutation shows up in the fur. A new mutation in the germline, visible to the naked eye and countable. Then he did it about 7 million times. That is why they call it the Mega Mouse Project. The facility at Oak Ridge became known as the Mouse House, and at its peak it held around 250,000 animals. His wife and colleague Leanne Russell did the parallel work on when in development an embryo is most vulnerable, and her results are still why pregnant women get asked before an X-ray. So 3 findings came out of this, and they matter in order. First, and this is the one that the whole film has been waiting for up until this point, radiation causes heritable mutations. Damage the germ cells of a mammal with ionizing radiation, and its offspring carry new mutations that the parent did not have. That is not a theory. That is counted, replicated, and textbooked. Second, and this one nobody expected, the fruit fly work everybody had built the field on said that total dose was all that mattered. Russell found that it was not. Deliver the same total dose slowly instead of all at once, and you get roughly 1/3 as many mutations, which means the cells were repairing themselves in between hits. The damage isn't a tally, it is a race between breaking and mending. Third, and this is the one that should have been shouted from the rooftops in every barracks in the Pacific, leave a longer gap between the irradiation and the conception, and the genetic risk to the child drops. Those numbers went on to underpin the concept of a doubling dose, meaning how much radiation it takes to double the natural mutation rate. And the double dose is how the International Commission of Radiological Protection and the BEIR committees and UNESCO still estimate genetic risk to human beings today. Every official statement any government has ever made about the genetic risk of radiation to your children rests in the end on the mice at Oak Ridge. But 2 caveats, and I'd rather give them to you than have you find them. The specific locus test only sees mutations at those 7 chosen genes. Anything silent, anything elsewhere, it misses completely. So the numbers coming out of Oak Ridge are almost certainly an undercount. And in the 1990s, a colleague of Russell's, a geneticist named Paul Selby, alleged that clusters of spontaneous mutations in the control data hadn't been reported properly, which would affect the baseline everything else was measured against. It became a long and bitter dispute over data integrity inside the lab that produced the world's radiation safety numbers. But strip all of that out and the headline holds: radiation causes inheritable genetic damage in a mammal. We have known about it since the 1950s. It isn't controversial and it isn't fringe. And the 19-year-old on that beach was made of exactly the same stuff as those mice. Which means the sentence we started with should be provable. Not plausible, provable. We have the mechanism, we have the animal data, we have 70 years and the entire human genome sequenced twice over. So where is it? Where is it in the people? This is the act I have been building towards, and it is the one where it would be very easy to lie to you by selection. You were born into a broken body. We've tested 3 clauses of that, and they have held. This is the one where it lives or dies. So before we start, thousands of families have been making this claim for 60 years, and I need to tell you what happened when people went looking. They have never proved it. Not for want of trying. Some of the most careful genetic studies ever run on human beings were built around exactly this question. I'm going to show you both sides properly, and you won't like it either way. So let's start with the largest and longest study of the genetics of radiation ever conducted on human beings. Since 1948, first as the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission and then as the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, researchers have followed the children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors, over 30,000 of them, against a comparison group for over 70 years. They looked for everything: stillbirths and major malformations, deaths in the first weeks, shifts in the sex ratio, childhood cancers. Then, as tools improved, chromosomal abnormalities, then protein variants, and now whole genome sequences. RUF's own position stated plainly on their website: Now hold on, because that sentence is more complicated than it looks and both camps misuse it. The medium gonadal dose to those parents was around 0.14 gray, which is a real dose, but on the mouse curves, it's low enough that a null result is exactly what you'd predict. The Oak Ridge data doesn't say Hiroshima should have shown an effect. It says an effect that size would be invisible in a cohort that size. And it's worth knowing that when James Neal, who ran the study from the beginning, reappraised the data in 1981, he noted that every indicator was trending in the direction of harm. None of them significantly, but all of them the same way. That's not proof, but it's not nothing either. Then in April 2021, the strongest single piece of evidence in this entire film landed in the Journal of Science. A team led by the National Cancer Institute took 130 children born between 1987 and 2002, to parents who had been Chernobyl liquidators or evacuees. They sequenced the entire genome of each child and both parents. Mother, father, child. So you can see precisely which mutations are new in that child and came from neither parent. Those are called de novo mutations, and every human being is born with somewhere around 50 to 100 of them. That's perfectly normal. That's just being alive. They reconstructed the parental gonadal doses. Then they counted. No increase in the number, no change in the type, no change in where in the genome they landed, no dose-response relationship. The lead author? Meredith Yeager. I'm not going to soften that. It's a well-designed study using the best methods available, aimed directly at the question that this film is asking, and it came back negative. And yet, in 1996, a geneticist at Leicester called Yuri Dubrova published in Nature. He'd looked at families in the Mogilev regions of Belarus, downwind of Chernobyl, and measured mutation rates in stretches of DNA called mini-satellites. Short sequences that repeated over and over and over again, which mutate quickly and are therefore easier to count than ordinary genes. In the exposed families, the rate was twice that of the control, and it tracked with cesium-137 contamination on the ground. He went further. Ukrainian families, the rate's up 1.6-fold, specifically in the father's line. Then Semipalatinsk, where the Soviet Union tested 456 devices over a populated steppe. Then the Teka River downstream of the Mayak plutonium plant. 4 populations, same signal. So why isn't that the end of this film? 3 problems, and they're real ones. Mini-satellites are non-coding. They sit in the junk drawer of the genome. Nobody has ever shown that a mini-satellite mutation makes a person ill, which means Dubrova may have measured a genuine effect on a part of the genome that just doesn't matter to health. Second, the control groups. Picking an unexposed population that matches an exposed one on everything except for radiation in the Soviet Union in the 1990s is close to impossible, and critics went after exactly that. Third, replication. Other groups looked at and found nothing. A Japanese team found no increase in children of liquidators. Another found nothing in the atomic bomb survivors' offspring. Dubrova answered every one of those criticisms in print. For 25 years, he died in 2023 with the argument unresolved. And to his credit, when the 2021 genome study came out and cut against everything he'd spent his career on, he publicly called it impressive work with excellent coverage. Then, New Zealand. 2 Royal New Zealand Navy frigates, 551 men, were stationed between 20 and 150 nautical miles from British hydrogen bomb tests in 1957 and 1958. Decades later, Professor Al Rowland at Massey University put their blood under a technique called multiplex fluorescence in situ hybridization, which paints each chromosome a different color so that you can see when pieces have swapped places. Published in 2008, in those veterans, they had 275 translocations and 12 dicentric chromosomes after 9,360 cells. In matched controls, 96 translocations, and 1 dicentric across a comparable count. That is a very large difference, and it is not a fluke. The New Zealand government's expert review accepted the statistics and then declined to accept the conclusion on the grounds that smoking hadn't been excluded as a confounder. Rowland has disputed the handling of it ever since. One of the reviewers, the Columbia radiation biologist David Brenner, called it extremely strong evidence in increased chromosomal aberrations. But be careful with what that study is, because this is where a lot of reporting goes wrong. Rowland measures chromosome damage in the veterans themselves. Somatic, their own cells, decades on, still carrying the scars. It is powerful evidence that something reached those men across 100 miles of ocean. But it is not evidence about their children. One last one, and it's the most important, because it is the only time anybody proposed exactly this mechanism for human beings and then tested it properly. In 1990, an epidemiologist named Martin Gardner published in the British Medical Journal. There was a cluster of childhood leukemia in the village of Seascale, next to the Sellafield nuclear site in West Cumbria. Gardner found it correlated with the father's radiation dose at work before the child was conceived. Paternal preconception radiation. Dad gets a dose at the plant. The child gets leukemia. Precisely the germline mechanism we have been chasing. It made every front page in Britain. And then it fell apart. Leo Kinlan found the same excess in Seascale children born elsewhere, whose fathers had no such exposure. A record linkage study in 1997 rejected the link. 49,000 children in the nuclear industry family study showed no dose trends, and the government's own advisory committee calculated that the dose those fathers received was around 200 times too low to explain the cluster. Richard Dole, the man who proved smoking causes lung cancer, came down on a completely different explanation. Kinlan's idea that moving outsiders into an isolated rural community spreads an ordinary infection through children with no immunity to it. I want to be clear about why I've included this one. Seascale is the closest anybody has come to a positive human result on the exact mechanism, and it did not survive contact with better data. If this film only showed you the studies that pointed the way it wanted, well, I'd have left it out. Leaving it out is how you end up making something that feels true, but isn't. So where does that leave our sentence? Proven in mice, never shown in us. 40 years of looking, some of it superb, nearly all of it pointing at nothing. And I could stop the film there. Plenty of people would. Case closed, nothing to see, the families are wrong, and the state is vindicated. Except there is one clause of that sentence that we haven't tested yet. The last one, in fact, the one everybody skips past because it sounds like the angry bit at the end. Because there are 2 reasons a question stays unanswered for 70 years. One of them is that the answer is no. The other is that somebody made certain you could never ask it properly. And that one, it turns out, they wrote down. Let's go back to that memo. Colonel O.G. Hayward of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers writing to Dr. Fiddler at Oak Ridge. Subject line, medical experiments on humans. A related reclassification memo from the month before is even more direct about the reasoning. It says that certain uranium documents may involve matters prejudicial to the best interests of the Atomic Energy Commission in that experiments with humans are involved. Prejudicial to the best interests of the Commission. That is the sentence. That is the whole thing right there. Not prejudicial to national security, not prejudicial to the subjects who don't get a mention. Prejudicial to the institution. Those documents did not become public until 1994 when President Clinton convened the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, and the committee's findings after going through the archives was that Cold War secrecy had expanded well past national security. It covered prestige, it covered, in the committee's own language, embarrassment. As late as 1949, decisions about whether to declassify reports on human experiments were being screened for their public relations consequences and their legal liability implications. 47 years between the writing and the reading. Most of the people it concerned were dead before anybody read it back to them. Now think about what obstruction actually does to a scientific question, because it isn't just about hiding the crime, it's about making the crime unmeasurable. Every study in Act 5 needed one thing to work: dose. You cannot look for a dose-response relationship without knowing the dose. It is the entire ballgame. The Chernobyl study reconstructed parental gonadal doses. Rafts, whole edifices, rests on dose reconstruction from Hiroshima. Dubrova mapped cesium on the ground. Now consider a British serviceman who stood on a beach at Christmas Island in 1958 in shorts and a pair of sunglasses with a film badge that may or may not have been issued, may or may not have been read, and whose record may or may not still exist. What was his dose? Nobody knows. And because nobody knows, he cannot be included in a dose-response study. He is not a data point, he's an anecdote. Since September 2023, British nuclear test veterans have been back in legal action against the Ministry of Defence, this time not over compensation but over records. Campaigners including Alan Owen, who runs the group Lab Rats and is himself the son of a test veteran, and Steve Pearce, a descendant, allege that blood and urine test results were taken from servicemen at the time, and that those results exist and just have not been disclosed. They allege ministers blocked information being passed to next of kin in 2022. The Ministry of Defence's position is that no information is withheld from veterans. It also states that cancer and mortality rates among test participants are similar to those who served at the same time and did not attend the tests, and lower than the general population. Both of those things can be comfortably true at once, and the only way to settle it is with the paperwork. And remember Porton Down. Those men signed the Official Secrets Act, which means for a decade or 4 decades, they could not describe their own exposure to their own doctors. Multiply that by 20,000 men and you don't just have a cover-up, you have a permanent hole in the medical record of the United Kingdom. You can't study people who are not permitted to say what happened to them. In 2021, an investigation called the Morarua Files was published by the French newsroom Disclose, working with the research group Interpret and the physicist Sébastien Philippe at Princeton. It came out as a book called Toxique. They took around 2,000 pages of French Defense Ministry documents, declassified in 2013 and largely ignored, and reconstructed the fallout from France's nuclear testing program in the Pacific. 193 tests at Morarua and Fangataufa between 1966 and 1996, 41 of them in the open air before 1974. The French state's own estimates said the exposed population was small. Philippe's team calculated that roughly 90% of the people living in French Polynesia at the time, around 110,000 out of 125,000, had been exposed. Around 10 times the official figure, with individual doses 2 to 10 times higher than the state's 2006 assessment. And I want to give you the details that show you how this is done, because it is not usually a shredder. It's usually an assumption. When France modelled how much radioactivity people had swallowed, it assumed islanders drank river water. They didn't. They collected rainwater off their roofs, which is precisely where fallout lands. Change one assumption in a model and the dose to a whole population falls by an order of magnitude, and the compensation threshold nobody can now meet writes itself. A French parliamentary commission of inquiry has since confirmed the decades of concealment. On the 1st of March 1954, the United States detonated a 15 megaton thermonuclear device at Bikini Atoll. It was called Castle Bravo. It was around 2.5 times bigger than predicted, and the wind was wrong. Fallout fell on the inhabited atolls of Rongelap, Allegheny, and Utrecht. 239 Marjolese people were caught underneath it. Children played in the ash. It looked like snow, and none of them had ever seen snow. What happens next is the part that belongs in this film. The United States did not simply evacuate them and treat them, it enrolled them. That was the study of response of human beings. They simply became a cohort, and in 1957, 3 years later, the people of Rongelap were returned to their atoll, which was still contaminated. Brookhaven National Laboratories noted that the resettlement would afford valuable ecological radiation data on human beings. By 1974, of the 19 Rongelap children who had been under the age of 10 when the fallout fell, all but 2 had developed thyroid nodules. The first cancer death was a teenage boy, leukemia, in 1972. The Rongelapese finally left in 1985, not evacuated by the United States, taken off the island by Greenpeace on the Rainbow Warrior. I want to finish this act with the one government that actually did the opposite, because otherwise this all sounds inevitable, which it isn't, because it is a choice, and at least once somebody chose differently. Between 1948 and 1960, the Israeli health authorities ran a mass campaign against ringworm of the scalp among new immigrant children, most of them from North Africa and the Middle East. The treatment was X-ray epilation. Irradiate the scalp, the hair falls out, and you treat the fungus underneath. Tens of thousands of children went through it. The dose to the head was substantial, and the children were overwhelmingly from one section of the population. Decades later, an Israeli epidemiologist called Barak Modan followed a cohort of more than 10,000 of them and found the excess. Tumors of the head and neck, thyroid cancer. The radiation did what radiation does, on a delay of 20 to 30 years. And in 1994, the Knesset passed a compensation law for the victims. Israel is, as far as I can establish, the only country in the world with a statute on the books compensating people for a state radiation program carried out on them as children. It sure as shit does not undo it, but at least somebody stood up and put it in the law, which is more than most of the governments in this film ever managed. So let's put our sentence back together. Something was done to your father. True. Mustard on the skin of men who were told it was a cure for the common cold. Dioxin on troops and on farmers. X-rays on the scalp of immigrant children. Fallout on a village that thought it was snow. That is not contested by anybody. It got inside of him. True. It's in his lungs, his blood, his thyroid, his bones. Governments have been paying out for that for 30 years because they ran out of ways to deny it. It damaged the part of him that was going to become you. Possible. Proven in 7 million mice, never demonstrated in a single human being at the doses real people actually received. Your illnesses were handed to you, unknown, and it will probably stay unknown because the people who could have answered it are nearly all dead now. And then they spent the rest of the century making sure you could never prove it. That one's true. That's the answer. And I know it is not the one anybody wants. 4 of those clauses are documented or possible or unknowable. One of them is a confession, and it is the one everybody treats as the emotional bit tacked on the end. They burned the paper, they classified the exposures, they put men under the Official Secrets Act so they couldn't describe their own symptoms to their own doctor. They modelled rainwater as river water and watched 100,000 people fall below the compensation threshold. They resettled a village onto a contaminated island and called it valuable ecological data. And in April 1947, a colonel wrote down that no document should be released which might result in legal suits, and then they were true to their word for 47 years. Every one of those decisions removed a number, and every number they removed made the study that would have answered this little bit more impossible to run. You cannot find a dose-response relationship without the dose. You cannot study a population that isn't allowed to say what happened to it. You cannot follow a cohort of men who died before anybody wrote down their exposures. You didn't need to disprove the claim. They just had to make sure we could never test it. And that is far cheaper. It's a much cheaper thing to do. And as we see, it works forever. There's a man somewhere in this country tonight with a photograph of himself at 19, shorts, cotton shirt, back to the horizon, and a child who's been ill their whole life. He will never know whether those two things are connected. Neither will I, or you. Neither will the best laboratory on earth, because the numbers that would have told him were never written down. Or they were written down, but then they were burned. Or they are still sitting in a file somewhere in a Ministry of Defense, somewhere where the Ministry of Defense says it's not. So no, I can't tell you that you were born into a broken body, but I most certainly can tell you somebody made very sure you would never find out.